was in the barbershop, and then like in front of the barbershop, there were like three guys with AK-47s who had like released over 100 rounds. And I'm on the floor with my
What?
barber, and it felt like 2 hours. I don't know, it felt like 2 hours. And all I remember is being on the floor, and then like I wanted to run, but like I didn't know where. But the sound of like I've never heard like I've been to like a shooting range, and so like I've heard
Yeah.
like, but I've never heard like gunfire and
Yeah.
like
Assault
urban,
rifle.
yeah,
Yeah.
like assault rifle and but it was very like whoa, like and I'm thinking about like, hey, okay, if I was a police officer and I saw that response, I don't even know what I would do. Like I just would just be like, this is too much.
So, welcome to episode 7 of Office Hours with Abbie and Juwan. This was a really interesting interview. I was really into her perspective and the way that I don't know, for me at least, there were so many things she said that I was like, oh yeah, duh, like that makes sense. But it just, the way that she was saying it was like kind of eye-opening in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that she had mentioned that I really appreciated was this. So often we think about self-care as the thing that we approach at the end of our day. So like, whatever makes you feel like a good wind down. So a bath, a face mask, like whatever makes you feel chill. And I think we often do that because we've endured a bunch of stress throughout our day and our heart rate's been elevated and we've had all of these chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol flowing through our bodies and our brains because we are enduring stress or encountering stress. And I really liked her idea of priming the brain. So thinking about what you do first thing to increase the endorphins, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, so that when you approach stress throughout your day, the actual power of that stress is then curtailed by the feel goods that she mentioned cycling through. So I thought that was really cool. And I wanted to ask you if you have a morning routine or what you do to feel good.
Yeah, I do have a morning routine. And I thought it was so interesting because, this word trauma, we kind of throw it around. I like you said, it's like, oh, pet the cat, like water a flower. And we kind of thought about trauma as this kind of these flowery responses.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. I think COVID-19 has really changed a lot of this. I think, for some of us who have models, we're either workaholics or we saw our parents work, or we have these perceptions that people put on us. We didn't really think about self-care and mental health care, even though we, kind of have these things in the periphery. But COVID really brought that to light and
Yeah.
attention. And a lot of scholars have been kind of talk about that people might have good like physical hygiene and but we haven't had like I heard a scholar talk about like mental hygiene, and that kind of like I was like, oh wow, like I never thought. It's like, yeah, like brush your teeth every day, like you got to have like good mental hygiene. And specifically this scholar his research is about sleep hygiene, right? This idea that you can even prime the brain by just getting good amounts of rest. And I'm very guilty of, I'll read all night, I'll write papers all night, pop back up, teach class. But you have to realize that if you don't have good sleep hygiene, you can't even move forward. So I think, eat this conversation now. Before, I think people may say, oh, that trauma stuff, out the window. But I think, when people were trapped, in their houses and had to figure out how they were going to demarcate the day and what they
Yeah.
were going to do to keep themselves sane because, you have cabin fever. So for me, I have some non-negotiables. And that's really difficult for me because I'm a type of person that's like, I'm an academic, I'm all over the place, but I make sure that like I at least read and meditate every morning, right? And
Mhm.
so there's some mornings where like I teach class on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9:30. I might get up late and I get to the office at 9 o'clock, and I'll make sure even if it's for 15 minutes, like I gotta go ahead and do that, even if it's going to bleed into something
Mm.
every day. I feel like what that really does for me is it really centers me and helps me kind of just think about my day. Also, wanting to feel good. Something I was really proud of myself this semester is that every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Just give a shout out to Jake as a student in the philosophy department. We've been reading Tommy Shelby's book, The Case like for Abolition, and we meet at a coffee shop right here, Rose Coffee in Cincinnati. It's like probably 5 minutes off of campus, and we just have a discussion around the chapters. He comes from his philosophy background, and that's something that I'm not getting credit for tenure wise or just, but it's something that just makes me feel good. I feel really great after we have those discussions. We kind of talked about the work. Reminds me that I'm kind of like still in grad school. I feel very kind of cool and hip. But those are some of the routines. As I approach 30 and I feel like I'm getting old, those are some of the routines that I do. And that's something I don't think I was kind of cognizant of probably before really COVID. But those are the things when, somebody may say something, or you may run into a difficult person, or something may frustrate you. It's like, well, I've kind of already done it out the way, and this is the routine. And even when I'm having like a down day, I think I really appreciated when she was talking about learning your body. When I feel like I'm having a down day, having that routine every Tuesday, it like has me something to look forward to. And I
Yeah.
will be remiss that every Saturday, like shameless plug, I take a walk with John Eck, the policing scholar, and John's like 70 years old. He's like, hey, do you want to take a walk? And I thought like a walk is maybe 30 minutes an hour. We walk from Cincinnati to Kentucky almost every Saturday. So we're talking about 7-8 mile walk back and forth. And at first I was like, whoa, that's a lot of time out of my day. But what I realized, which was really great, is that even though I'm super busy, those Saturdays is a time for me to kind of just like relax,
Mm,
and the world is not so busy, and we get to interact with nature and see Cincinnati, and I'm having conversations that I wouldn't normally have. And
mm,
then I'm so tired by the end of the walk that I can do nothing but just go to sleep, for the rest of the day. And for me, I would just, if I wasn't walking on Saturdays with John, I just would be like, oh, meeting, zoom,
yeah.
zoom, zoom, run over here. And it's great to be like Saturday is like, now for me, Saturday, I don't get any work done on Saturday because I'm forced not to. And it's been really awesome. But I wonder what's your primers, if you have any morning routine or weekly routines that you do.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I've always been like exercise person. So
Yeah.
every morning I either go to the gym or do a hike or do, like today I did Pilates at home. Um but most days I'm at the gym lifting, and that is definitely my, like, where I need to release stress that's been built up or whatever. And it's really hard, like when life has been throwing a lot at me recently, and it's been really hard to stay in routine. But I know that if I just like am sad for myself on the couch eating Cheetos all day, like it'll just make me more depressed. So if I can like push myself, no matter how emotionally drained I am, if I can just push myself to get to the gym, to be in routine, I know that that also proves to myself, like the other day or yesterday, I was doing these devil presses, which is you have two dumbbells and you put them on the floor and you do a burpee, and then you come up and you kind of swing them to press overhead. And I had two left. And in my head, I was just like, you don't give up. This is a representation of life. When things get hard, you don't stop. And I was just like, do not stop, because if you stop, that's like going to represent everything about your life, which like maybe not healthy, but it was really helpful. And I will say, like, as I'm getting more involved in social media and TikTok and everything, I am guilty of like first thing in the morning checking everything. And I want to get out of that, because I think that is like priming my brain for all those stress hormones. So I need to really consider, like, and be critical of like, okay, how can I fill my morning solely with those feel goods? Like, how can I take stock of the activities that I do that are bringing me stress, and then kind of put those to the side after I've done, even if I have to engage? How can I prime myself to only do these things so that when I do approach those more stressful activities, I can limit their power?
Yeah.
Um, so that's something that I think we should all do, and think critically about how do we want to start our day, which I know also like can put a lot of pressure on that, like, oh God, I need the morning to be perfect. And like, what if while I'm meditating, like an emergency call comes in or whatever? And
Yeah.
we have to give ourselves some grace there and kind of look at it as the big picture, right? If there's 365 days out of the year, like if you can do 330 of those days
Yeah.
having a solid morning routine, like, you know 330 out of 365 doesn't sound bad, but when you think about, like, that's an entire month off of a solid morning routine, but like in the grand scheme, that's okay.
And I think so too. I think you need to have a good morning routine, but it's also every day is not going to be a good day, right? You can't
Right.
have a strain. And one of the things, like when I do find myself, Cheetos is not my, well, Cheetos, I do like Cheetos.
Cheetos
Um,
isn't my choice either. I
oh,
don't
but
know why.
Cincinnati has these chips called Grippos. I don't know if you ever heard of them. I
Uh-uh.
have to send you some.
Yeah, please do.
Fantastic. And that's my go-to. But I find that when I do have those bad days, I'm kind of in that fog or in that rut, which is actually helpful to me. Something that I've learned is that even when I'm in one of those like fogs, is to like try to do one thing.
Yeah.
Even when I don't feel like, because when I do that one thing, then the next day, if I'm still in that fog, at least there's something done, and I don't have to like. Once I get out of that fog, and I'm like, oh, okay, I have all these things. And there was a poem. I gave a talk at the school, which I thought was great, and I think this is great for like graduate students, community members, PhD students, professors. That really changed my life. It's called "I Am Only One." It's really short. It says, "I am only one. I can't do everything, but I can do something, and I will not let what I cannot do interfere with I can do." And so I've been like so fascinated with this poem because every day if I'm like working on a challenging project or if I'm having a bad day, if I'm stuck, I'm like, what can I do? Right. I'm not going to let what I like. There's some things where you're like, oh, I don't know this method, or I may not have read this book, or, I don't know how to do. So I'm like, okay, what can I do? Right. Because I'm not going to let the things I cannot do interfere. There's just some things I probably can do. Can I put my name on the page? Can I do a
Mhm.
title? Can I do the methods? Like, can I just read this? And so what I figured out is when I focus on the things I can do, the things I can't do become more manageable.
Yeah.
Um, and I find myself like getting that momentum where things I were stuck at, I figure out like how to do them instead of focusing on like, I can't figure out this one thing. And so like I'll try to work around that problem, but that's been really great to incorporate just in my lifestyle too, far as kind of developing that really great like mental hygiene too.
Yeah, well, it kind of reminds me, there was that study done looking at when we prime students to
Mhm.
say like, you're bad at math, and then they go into a math exam, they do worse because they've been primed to believe that they're not good at something. So what you're kind of describing is that you're priming your brain to do something that you at least know that you're good at. So then when you approach that thing again that you're not as good at, you're in a state where you have more confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I've already tackled like so many things. I'm like, okay, now I figured it out. But it also gives me room to like think about that issue and it becomes really less daunting. So I thought that was really great. And I really like how um she took that idea and really applied it to like policing, which I
Yeah.
think is like a really important about how police are learning about right these neurological dysregulations, right? Identifying their behaviors, their actions, and themselves. I also think about my brother who's a police officer, and he talks about this a lot. He went to a police training similar to the one that you talked about in the podcast, where he was saying that and I also shared an article about these ideas that like this is a new article in Washington Post talk about there's trauma on both sides
Mhm.
about police and community relations, and this idea that he was learning in his training, and I don't know the exact number but during like a patrol that police will experience several
Right.
incidents of traumatic stress, um and then but they're also patrolling communities, right, that we know have been traumatized, and just those interactions they have in between. And I think one of the things, the critiques about policing that we haven't made that goes unnoticed, and I think it's a segue from my other episode of like people who like abolitionists or reformers not caring about the correctional officers or the actual actors in the system because they're kind of upholding kind of racist values. But when there were like George Floyd protests and the pandemic protests, and it was really interesting. I was talking to officers; they were going through some of the same kind of mental deficiencies that the whole world was, right? When we were kind of on lockdown, right? It was people were fighting over hand sanitizer and thing. They were going, but in policing, they still had to go out and do their jobs.
Right.
Like some of us got a break, like we didn't have to go into the office and we had other, but the policing department never got a break. They never got a pause. And I think one of the critiques that we need to lift up is that, for police that are going through these things, like where is there, like, can the National Guard come in and like police officers get a break, or can another entity step in? And I often worry about that. The reason why we may have these interactions, fatal interactions with police and communities, because police officers are human too. But we don't, where's the space that we have allowed them to focus on really this mental hygiene, right? To say that, hey, they didn't get a chance to understand the George Floyd protests because they weren't in it every day, right? And some of them, and then they were actually asked to work more hours because the manpower was short. So that's things I worry about. I don't know if we've done a great critique of that in the scholarly debate or even from a reformist type of aspect.
No, totally. I think that's a great point. We never, because we so often contextualize street violence within the framework of trauma, but when we think about police shootings and all of that, it's often more so framed within racism.
Right.
And while I think there's some truth to that, I do think it's incredibly important to think about the stress that police are so often engaged in. I mean, so many of the police officers that I've interviewed talk about being diagnosed with PTSD, and they talk about how stressful it is to go into certain situations. And I thought that the way that EO was talking about it in the episode, where you're teaching about neurological regulation, not only to consider the ways that you feel, like what's coming up in your body, how are you reacting, but also to then contextualize the way that others are reacting to you. So when I was sitting in on this police training, it was really interesting because we watched a video that happened, I think it was in 2016, I can't remember, when Kim Porter or Potter shot Dante Wright. So in the video, you see that he's in the car, 3 officers kind of swarm. The driver's door is open, 3 officers swarm, and he goes to reach for something, and she says, taser, 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 pulls her gun, shoots him like 3 times or 4 times with a lethal gun with bullets. And so she supposedly mistakenly did not draw, which I don't know if it was after this that they put it in they put your gun in your non-dominant hand so that it's not as easy to just pull. But in the conversation with the police officers after watching that, they were saying how she was clearly in a state of heightened stress. And so someone should have kind of pulled her to the side and realized that she was kind of in this heightened stress. But they were not excusing it at all. I think everyone in that room was pretty critical, but they were contextualizing it. And then there was a lack of criticism or a lack of understanding as to why, because we watched a couple of these shooting videos, and there was a lack of understanding as to like, why would someone run if they didn't do something wrong? Or why would someone like be combative? And it's exactly those same reasons. It's because these individuals have been primed with this fight or flight when they see police because of this historical trauma that we've discussed in other episodes about the history of policing and all this. And so when you're like, I've interviewed guys in the streets who are like, when I see police, even though I have a totally clean record, like I don't even know why, but I just run, like
Me too. Yeah. Like, I think I said it too. Like, she's a grandmother. She's like, I didn't do anything wrong, but like you see those blue lights and you're like, oh, you have those feelings. And not to cut you off, but I think what's really important what you say is, and I don't know how we could do this, but I've been really playing around with this idea is that if you have officers, right? So I'm talking to officers who around Christmas time, a lot of people are committing suicide. We have to
Yeah.
cut people down out of their closets and do all this. And I asked, how do you process? They're like, oh, you just have to act like it's Halloween, right? And I'm like, okay, that's because but I say that all to say, like, wouldn't it be like awesome, or like I don't know how we physically do this, but if an officer has experienced a traumatic event, someone has just killed themselves, or they come to a shooting, or it's like you wouldn't want that officer to continue
Right.
with their regular patrol. There has to be a way where you can pull that officer. Okay, maybe he's in the office for the rest of the day, or there's some other non-trivial tasks like tickets he can get into. But the problem is you have officers who are experiencing all these traumatic events on patrol, and then they're at, this person is suicide, they're saying this dead body, they're pulling you over for a car stop, then they're checking with the cat on the in the tree. I think that's a like a really thing that we're overlooking in policing, is that we can't have people like responding to these traumatic events all day and then having interactions with citizens. And I think that's one of the things. And I know there's been a lot of controversy around Isaiah Thomas, who's a Philadelphia council member, drafted the driving equity bill, and I think they're going to adopt it for the Tyree Nichols case as well. And I think it's this whole idea is, how do you limit police interactions, right? So we don't want police pulling people over for a little or air freshener in the window and different things. So there has to be ways, I think, that we have to like also kind of limit police interactions, but also like, how do we interfere? I think in the Kim Porter case, like officers who are going to experience traumatic events, to kind of pull them to the side and have them do something elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think some people might rebut by saying, like, well, they chose this path, they chose this job, and they should be trained to be able to cut someone down from hanging in their closet to then going to a domestic violence incident. But it's like, do we actually want to be a society that like tries to prepare people for that? Is there a way? I think that's a great point. Like, if we're talking about reformist efforts, if we're gonna still have police while we're like pushing towards some other means of, enhancing public safety, then we have to consider what you're saying. Like, if someone, and I think part of that is like changing the culture around defining trauma, because I think it's really difficult for a police officer to say, like, I think it would be, given police culture, I think it would be really hard for an officer to admit, like, hey, I just went to a really difficult call. Can I please sit?
I
Uh,
think you hit on the head, because I had an officer who I was working with, he's in leadership, so he has a ranking position. And he says, he goes to this new district and he's the commanding officer, on the scene. And the person has committed suicide, and he has to be the strong, because if he shows that he's freaked out about it, his fellow officers who report to him is going to be freaked out about it. So imagine like trying to have the courage and the strength, you've seen this traumatic thing and you're trying to hold it all together to make it, and I feel like that's you get to that point, right? But how do we change policing culture to say that you can say, hey, listen, I'm not okay, with this, we can all say that we're not okay with this. But I think that's in policing culture, that these commanding officers, we don't give these weight to that. They have to go in and act like, they've been there before. This situation doesn't bother them, just so they don't freak out, the officers that follow them. And I think that's potentially problematic. And we kind of see these interactions, with police interactions, whether it be unarmed shootings or different aspects as well. Like, I wonder how many commanding officers are kind of just saving face,
right.
in that aspect, of probably like really freaked out. Because I mean, nothing, I don't think you can prepare officers for all of the challenges and things, because it's just life, right? It's just like, I don't even think there's so many combinations or events. I don't think you can prepare them for every scenario, every situation. And I think that's why, like, even if they have like these RBT trainings, like these reality-based trainings, like, oh, somebody is attacking you with a knife, or they have a gun, or, but that only can go but so far. And so I think we have to like think critically about the training methods and how we think about police.
Yeah. So then I guess, like, when I was asked, because I asked her, I was like, given what police are tasked to do, are you expecting a bigger outcome other than self-awareness in your trainings on, dealing with trauma and how others handle historical trauma? And as we're talking about this, even like a strong morning routine seems trivial in the face of approaching, like having to approach a situation that involves death or a horrible car accident or just these things that are so traumatic. Like, is you taking a bath or going to the gym or meditating, I mean, potentially it could have an impact on the ways that you approach that scene. um I'm questioning it all now, but I mean, I think it's better than to not, right? But then we have to think about like moving beyond just teaching emotional regulation and then actually considering like what we're tasking individuals to do and how to best deal with that. I think there has to be front end preparation, as we're talking about, in terms of that priming, and then back end understanding in terms of, like, as you were saying, taking someone off duty for the day, or switching their role for the day
Yeah,
following a traumatic incident.
I don't want to be like a a rebel rouser here or contentious. But when I used to work for the mayor's office, and I'll let people figure out what city it was. Um, so when I got the job, they had sick days, PTO days, and then they had like mental health days, right? And so, me just being young, immature, took a lot of, PTO, took some sick days. And I was kind of running out of time. And I'm like, and then my boss was like, hey, you can take a mental health day. And I'm like, what's a mental health day? And basically it's not PTO. It's not like you have to put in for vacation or like sick, but mental health days you can take it anytime. You don't have to provide any excuse. And there were like a couple, you could just take a mental health day. And I was thinking, the work we doing here at the mayor's office, is pretty stressful. But I mean, pretty much we're dealing with, shuffling paperwork, doing paperwork, meeting with but I was thinking of like that could be something, even police departments is, police departments have like police officers fill out activity logs, and I don't know like how they would do it versus scheduling, but it would seem as though that people could look at the activity that a police officer had, where they, got a gun off a street or made some arrests or that, and that they would be able to like take these mental health days. And so I think like what you're saying, I think the morning routine is a start, right? I don't think it's like the end all be all. But I think this neurological regulation is something we have to think about continually. And I think one of the things you can add on would be great. It's just like why don't police officers and firefighters, first responders, I think just generally, like why don't they? I mean, why don't everybody have mental health days? That's just number one. But especially for people that are like on the front line of defense, it just seems like they should just have mental health days, that when somebody can step in and say, hey, I don't know if you're aware, or I don't know if you're maybe feeling this or not, but given the activity that you had, the arrest that you made and the situation you encountered, you're going to have a mental health day. We're going to give you so many mental health days this month or tomorrow, and we would like you to do something that's going to be helpful to you. I think that would be a game changer.
Yeah, but I think not only just having the option, but also normalizing the practice, because even though officers are able to take, I think it was upwards of 60 days maybe following a shooting event, I interviewed 4 officers who had all shot and killed someone on duty, and almost all of them went back after like 3 days.
I think police do have this notion, or about getting back out there, being out in the streets, kind of being boots on the ground. But there's other factors, right, that are also important too.
Well, I think the question then becomes, too, if we're going to change culture, we also have to start at a much earlier age, right? Like we have to start teaching little kids about emotional regulation. Like I'll never forget, there was this viral video of this little boy. He was probably, I don't know, 5, and his brother was maybe 2.5 or 3, and his baby brother is about to freak out. And he's like, his mom is filming from like the corner, and you can see the little boy like just breathe, focus on your breathing. And he like does a big deep breath, and the little kid like stops he was about to have a tantrum, and he like calms down. And I think teaching kids at that young age about emotional regulation, about self-care, beyond this like, whitewashed woo woo spirit yoga thing of self-care, like it goes beyond that. And so teaching at a young age the importance of that. And because I like, you know, I have no idea what goes on in my body. Like I have no idea about my anatomy. I have no idea about my biology. Like I'm learning about my neurology at 32, which is really problematic. And so if we can learn at a young age about serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and noradrenaline and adrenaline and cortisol and what they do differently and how they, impact us, like that's an important thing to teach at a young age, so that we can see changes in culture and we can see people, despite whatever job they get into, really focusing on their well-being.
Yeah, no, this has been a great literature. I mean, I think like when we think about schooling and when we teach children, it was kind of geared toward tests and academic achievement, and that's kind of like there's been big books and things about emotional intelligence, right? About and that's really kind of input. But this idea that, like you said, about the way your body feels, and I think that's I have my even I think this is kind of like really interesting. My credit card company, American Express, they have a free subscription to Calm, right? This is
Mm,
cool app because this idea, they want you to kind of be healthy and different things and realizing that you may need to do things for your mental health. And I think we have to teach children, like, even younger, prepare children about that because, we weren't really, that wasn't really thought about these emotions. But more and more we see, even like in the criminal justice literature, how, juveniles different from adults. And there's been all these kind of studies that say like how the brain is kind of formulating up to 25. People may say even after that. And also just I think we learn like when we don't feel well, right, physically, we sometimes pay attention to our body, but
right.
oftentimes we don't, I think one of the great things about turning 30, approaching 30 is, I mean, I'm not completely there, but when I was early 20s, things would happen and I'm like, oh, all over the place. But 30 is like, oh no, I felt this before. I'm just kind of, and also not only being able to be in touch with your body, but to able to communicate and to others about it, right?
Yeah.
And there's times where I'm just like, oh, I was calling my friends, you know what? I'm in a little bit of a funk right now, but it'll be about a day or two, and then I'll be myself. And they're like, oh wow, and I'm like, because I've been here before. So that's great to like not only know, but to be able to communicate that
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
other, you know?
Yeah. The idea of like the physical, I don't know, going back to this idea of sick days, like, yeah, mental health day. I don't know, just it clicked for a second, like seeing that very clear parallel between a physical sick day and a mental sick day, right? Like, I
Those are
just,
two different things. Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And at
Yeah.
first, it took me a long because I was trying to make this distinction, like what a mental health day, let's say, and it was like there was times where it's like sometimes you wake up and like our schedules are flexible as being professors. Like sometimes you just need a mental health day. You need
Yeah.
a day where you're like, I'm not checking the email. I'm not looking at the phone. I'm turning it off. I'm going for a walk, and it's okay to have those days. You will need one of those days where it just your mind gets kind of bogged up and you just need a day. And that's not, but I think we put these pressures. I was having a call with one of my colleagues, writing call, and she was physically sick though. And she was saying she had this talk, big talk. She was invited to give this talk at Harvard, but she got sick on the other talk and she was going back and forth like, I don't want to skip out on the talk, but I physically am sick and I just can't give it, but I'm not feeling well, but I could do it, but it probably is going to suck anyway. So she wound up not doing it, but kind of beating herself up about
Mhm.
it. I was thinking, dang, what would I do in that situation? I probably was like, I probably would get the talk. I probably get the talk sick because it's at Harvard, and I'm giving a talk at the University of Cambridge in June. I'm like, if I get sick, listen, everybody in that room gonna be sick because I'm going there with my mask on, and I'm gonna get that talk. But I think that is really bad thinking because we haven't, and there's times where we don't physically wake up sick, but we are mentally not there.
Yeah.
Right. That's not saying that, anything is wrong, but we just mentally just don't have the strength to do it.
Yeah. I think the other thing too to consider is like, I guess one of the things that the pandemic taught us is to maybe be a bit more altruistic in a way with our bodies and our sicknesses, and to not push it so that we can do the work, because by pushing it and going, like, we're inevitably getting other people sick, and we should consider that. But I think that it's important too, when thinking about mental health, like, our energy influences other people too. So when we're having an off day, that shit can be contagious, right? Like, and
Totally.
so when we're thinking about like the boundaries we need to set for ourselves when we're physically sick, we need to set those same boundaries in an altruistic way when we're feeling down or off or whatever mentally, because that can influence, that energy can influence other people's energy as well. So yeah, I think that's important to consider. I want to close by just briefly, noting about the Nashville school shooting, because I watched that body cam footage like so many times, because I don't know why, because we're like obsessed with trauma. We as a society like love watching horrible things. But um I watched that body cam video so many times, and it was really impressive. Like, I would love to speak to the guy who the body cam footage is of, because he seemed so calm
Yeah.
throughout, and he like was talking to the other officers in like a pretty calm way, even though they were about to like engage in this really horrible thing. And so I would be really curious to talk to him and ask him about his morning routine, and ask him like what he does to, what kind of training that he has indulged in, either personally or like in the academy, that has allowed him to, you know, uh, control to some degree those stress hormones that are inevitably going to come up in a stressful situation.
Yeah, and well, that's why I love having these conversations, especially with you, that I think we really have to be fair in
Yeah.
our approach. And one of the things is too is we oftentimes, and it's not to give an excuse to officers because I don't think that's like we just you get blanket immunity for this. But I mean, humans, and I think this goes to the neurological regulation, like self-perseverance, like they're going to active shooters and making police stops knowing that they might die. Right.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that that goes into the head, like, to get the call to say, hey, I think there was an active shooter. I was on a writing call this morning in Pittsburgh. And I was just thinking, like, you get this call as an officer, there's an active shooter, you put on your bulletproof vest and you realize that this
Right.
could be the day that you may not come back. And I
Yeah.
think that's a real reality. And I oftentimes there's no amount of training, right? I mean, there's probably a level of training that prepares you, but I mean, you just think about like the physiologically and the neurological responses that happen, that really has to be, I mean, that's tough, right? That's a
Yeah.
tough experience, I mean, and oftentimes too, like people are not used to like gunfire. Like I was in the barbershop a couple years, maybe 2, 3 years ago, and like I was in the barbershop, and then like in front of the barbershop, there were like three guys with AK-47s who had like released over 100 rounds. And I'm on the floor with my
What?
barber, and it felt like 2 hours. I don't know, it felt like 2 hours. And all I remember is being on the floor, and then like I wanted to run, but like I didn't know where. But the sound of like I've never heard like I've been to like a shooting range, and so like I've heard
Yeah.
like, but I've never heard like gunfire and
Yeah.
like
Assault
urban,
rifle.
yeah,
Yeah.
like assault rifle and but it was very like whoa, like and I'm thinking about like, hey, okay, if I was a police officer and I saw that response, I don't even know what I would do. Like I just would just be like, this is too much.
Oh
Like
my
this is
God. It's really interesting. I think we really do. We have to balance between giving credit where credit is due in terms of like saving lives, but also thinking about alternative means, right? Like, I think it's really hard for people to allow the coexistence of those two things. And so while I can say, like, yes, I'm a police abolitionist, and I think that we need some other mechanisms to enhance public safety. Like, if I was at ASU and there was an active shooter, I would probably be calling the police, right? Like, because we don't have anything else in its place right now. So I think just considering, like, in those moments of high stress, how can we set ourselves up at the beginning of the day to limit that stress? But then also now, like, in this real time, what are we going to do with those officers who are at that school? Like, are we expecting them to go back to work tomorrow? Like, what is our game plan now in terms of care?
I think we have to get to a point where, and that's what I'm challenging myself. I think I had a bias even from last week, right? Like thinking about prison abolition and police abolition, not just for community residents, right? But it's also not feasible and has
Right.
detrimental effects for the criminal justice actors as well.
Right. Yeah, it's a need for deep cultural change if we actually want to see shifts towards less racism, shifts towards more focus on mental health and decreased stress. Like, this is a cultural issue that we really need to consider. I feel like we could go on for hours trying to unpack this and get all the nitty gritty so that it comes across in a way that, appeases all sides. But I think when it comes down to it, we just have to acknowledge that this shit is super complex, and we're at least trying to just start the conversation around it. And one of the things that I told my students yesterday, I think we live in a time where we're so focused on views and likes and follows that we don't consider ourselves influential unless we have, hundreds of thousands of or millions of followers. And we have to recognize that we all have influence, even over just one person. And if, again, what COVID taught us is that if we get one person sick, that bubble expands to hundreds. And so if we can influence at least one person or encourage one viewer to speak about this topic with one other person, then that is a seed for cultural change. And I hope that that empowers our viewers to feel like they have some agency in the way that things go in the future.
Like Dr. Yasir Payne says, just got to wake up one person.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you all for watching, and don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment with anything that comes up for you while you're listening to this, and I look forward to talking to you next time.